For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and you're watching our weekly flagship show, The Talking Point. Glad to be joined again from Moscow by Dr. Maxim Suchkov. He's the director and associate professor at MGIMO. Здравствуйте, добрый вечер. I'm sorry we are slightly late because of a technical issue, but thanks and good to see you again, Dr. Suchkov.
Likewise, thank you very much for having me.
And in the capital is a familiar face, Ambassador Dilip Sinha. He's been India's envoy to the United Nations in Geneva. He's also been the head of the United Nations division in the Ministry of External Affairs, as well as the Joint Secretary, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran in the MEA, and has written a book on the Security Council and the P5. Ambassador Sinha, good to see you again, sir.
Good to see you, Amitabh, and thank you for having me again.
Completely our pleasure. Dr. Suchkov, just to look at, how the world is dealing with a new reality in Afghanistan, the Taliban. Today at the Eastern Economic Forum, we heard President Vladimir Putin talking about what seems to us on the outside indications from both Russia and China that they would recognize the legitimacy of the Taliban government. Is that a correct reading?
Well, first of all, I think perhaps I should put it in a broader perspective for your viewers and for your listeners that there were four major issues that Russia discussed with the Taliban when they came to Moscow in July. And the issues included that pretty much similar to what the deal that Americans had, that the Taliban should not allow ISIS or any other terrorist organization to operate from Afghan soil to neighboring Central Asia and Russia, so no terrorist threat. Secondly, the issue of drug trafficking, that is a big threat for Russia. Also, there were issues back then discussed that there is no potential spillover of instability from Afghanistan into Central Asia. And finally, the safety of the country's diplomatic and consular missions. I should also note for the context that the Taliban recognized a terrorist organization since early 2000s. And, the discussions around that particular issue, because if we're talking about quote unquote political legitimacy, right, having de jure legitimacy, that is one issue that's still in the discussion. I don't think a political decision has been made, and Russia kind of operates on the presumption that given what happened in Afghanistan in recent week, the Taliban are de facto rulers, you have to deal with them, but the East, again, like I said, that they are recognized as a terrorist organization still has some obvious hurdles for the type of relationship that you can have with them.
Sure. Ambassador, just coming to you on what's been happening at the United Nations, the Security Council. A couple of meetings have been called, some statements coming out. The last one that came out, well, it went through, but Russia and China abstained with their, one of the points that Dr. Suchkov had also mentioned in terms of terrorism, specific groups had not been addressed in that. How is the United Nations Security Council dealing with the issue in your view, Ambassador?
Well, in my view, the Security Council has formally bypassed itself and made itself completely irrelevant to the Afghanistan process. You have in fact, a comical situation today where you have several leaders of the Taliban who are still on the 1988 sanctions list, including Mullah Baradar, Sirajuddin Haqqani, and Sher Abbas Stanikzai. These are all senior people. One of them might become the foreign minister, one might become the president. So we have this extremely comical situation where you have an organization that has listed terrorists as its leaders, but two of the permanent members, not only two, several permanent members are talking to them and seeking from them that they should not promote terrorism. Now, I thought terrorism was against international law and the whole world was fighting a war against terrorism. And here we are pleading with an organization that has a terrorist past and possibly a terrorist future, not to indulge in terrorism, not to promote regional instability, not to indulge in drug production. Whereas if you look at reports presented to the Security Council, including this year, as recently as March or February this year, the report said that the Taliban are indulging in drugs, they are indulging in terrorism, in attacking civilians. So we have a very peculiar situation today where you have an organization which has seized power by force, has not given any indication that it will honor any of the international treaties to which Afghanistan is a party, including several human rights treaties. And everybody is pleading with this organization to start behaving like a civilized international player.
Dr. Suchkov, your thoughts? I mean, before the Taliban took over on the 15th of August, when it reached Kabul and surprised almost everyone, including themselves, the international community, whether it was individually or at the UN, the US itself was saying, we will not recognize a government that takes over by force. But technically, there was no conflict. I mean, there was a lot of surrender there. But does the world, do individual countries have any choice, as you said, de facto the Taliban is in governance?
Look, nothing that I disagree with what the ambassador said. Obviously, and it makes perfect sense, especially when you look at it from India's perspective. And if you look at it from Moscow perspective, and that I think was mentioned on a few occasions by top Russian diplomats, Russia does not want basically to end up in a situation where it stands on its own kind of against the Taliban, whereas all the Europeans, the Americans, and the Chinese are working with them and cooperating them, and thus antagonizes them against the Taliban, right? That said, the Foreign Affairs Ministry made it clear that Russia is not going to jump, quote unquote, before everyone else in recognizing them, right? Russia's not going to make a first move and say, okay, the great guys, we agree. And while there is all this diplomatical maneuvering and dancing going, the security services, the Russian military are holding military drills with Central Asian neighbors, are beefing up their security. And the security services are pretty much making this point that while it may be, there's also this line kind of now in the mainstream media that, the Taliban are better guys in comparing to ISIS, because ISIS are the real terrorists and the Taliban are not. So basically, while all these debates about what type of political Islam they're promoting, what type of Islamic State they're constructing and how it may be different, there is also a sense that this is really, this kind of 50 shades of green for the random people, and for many people around the world who believe in extremist Islamist ideas. The success of the Taliban in Afghanistan may be a very kind of dangerous, very lucrative case, but also very dangerous for the neighbors, because they may think, what failed in Syria and Iraq finally succeeded in Afghanistan. Though that type of scenario, the Russian military and security services totally want to avoid. And while, like I said, there is this diplomatic engagement going on the other level, there is serious security and military concern, and I think Russia here is playing kind of on both chessboards, and that's part of the reason why Putin is engaged with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in kind of trying to establish this bilateral channel, I guess, between Russia and India, making sure that these particular threats are addressed throughout a different channel.
There were lots of complaints when India was not called to, say, the extended troika when Russia was involved, but that's all in the past. Ambassador, when you were talking about, say, the 1988 sanctions committee, travel bans, I think, which are scheduled to be taken up again, maybe I think on the 21st of September at the United Nations. How much of a stick and a carrot does the United Nations Security Council really have to keep the Taliban, or try to keep the Taliban to its words, and does the Taliban care?
I don't think the Taliban cares at all. The Taliban are now in power in Kabul, so being the de facto authority in Kabul at least, and in most of Afghanistan, most countries will have to deal with them, whether they like their policies or not. That is the basis on which international relations are organized. And even India, which continues to harbor suspicions, very legitimate suspicions about the Taliban, will have to engage with the Taliban. And our ambassador in Qatar met their representative in Qatar because a number of Indians are stranded in Afghanistan. And if we want to extricate them, we need the cooperation of the Taliban. And the Taliban will use all these levers to promote their recognition by the international community. Now, I mentioned about the power that Taliban have enjoyed. Take the United States. When it signed the agreement in February last year with the Taliban, the agreement said that it is signed between the United States and the Taliban, which is not recognized by the United States as a state. So here you have an agreement being signed by a country, and a superpower at that, with an organization that it does not recognize as an organization. Now, that was a year and a half ago. Today, the Taliban are in power. So everybody, including the Security Council, will have to engage with the Taliban, because if you want humanitarian assistance to reach the people of Afghanistan, and they need humanitarian assistance today, you can't let the people of Afghanistan die of hunger and the UN not act. So what is happening today is that the Security Council has handed over its responsibility of maintaining international peace and security, and the organization of the UN that will actually play a role now is the High Commissioner for Refugees, because that organization is the biggest of the UN organizations. They are already active in Afghanistan, but their role will become more important because they will have to go and provide humanitarian assistance to the people, for which they will require the Taliban's cooperation. And that obviously will be leveraged by the Taliban to get international recognition.
Dr. Suchkov, what is Russia's position on that? I mean, like you said, since 2002, the Taliban has been a terrorist group. I think the US has not designated the Taliban as a group. There may be individuals both in the US list and the United Nations list, like the Haqqanis. But how does Russia, like you're saying, they're playing different chessboards, look at it in terms of how you can leverage the Taliban's behavior?
Right. So, well, I think what we're seeing right now in Russian foreign policy is building this framework, the initial stages of building a framework with the Taliban. And this framework is coming from the premise that what are really the real options on the menu of your foreign policy choices, right? If your option is not to militarily fight them or intervene in Afghanistan, which is not obviously on the table, and if you have these constraints about recognizing them politically because you see them as a terrorist organization, right? There's got to be some maneuvering in between these two kind of major poles. And this is, I think, the process where Russia is trying to figure out. Now, Russian interest in Afghanistan, of course, much more limited to and oriented towards security of its own, what back in the time the British would call soft underbelly of Russia, which is Central Asia mainly. Whereas, say, the Chinese have more kind of expensive interest in economics and the Belt and Road Initiative and all these things. So the focus is indeed on the security, and there's also this conviction, and we'll see whether it proves right over time, that unlike, say, global terrorist organizations such as ISIS, the Taliban agenda is primarily local, and because they're kind of tribal based. But it's not going to go beyond the border of Afghanistan. So in that sense, they're less dangerous than ISIS. But like I said before, we'll see over time whether this premise still holds true or whether it was a wrong idea. But one thing more to mention, perhaps for your viewers, that for Russia, the Afghan story is not just about the Taliban. Now, obviously, the Taliban are now the big security challenge and the security issue that Russia has to think about all the time. And there is a risk that, not to make sure not to get overstretched across all the border. But there is also this issue of looking at the United States and what they did and what they did not do, rather in Afghanistan, and how that maybe, and this is kind of Russia is of course trying to make a big story of the US failure to make sure that it echoes and sits well with other U.S. allies who are relying on the United States, mostly in the post-Soviet space, but not only. So this is also kind of one thing that we need to bear in mind talking about Russia and Afghanistan scenario.
Sure. Ambassador, when you're talking about the US and its absolutely diabolical and messy way in which it withdrew, of course, it has the complete right to do that. But you mentioned both our ambassador in Qatar, Deepak Mittal. Officially, at least, there's a statement out now. There was a channel open before. India was also, like the US and other countries, talking about no force being used to take over a government. How do you read what India is doing now, whether it's individually or at the United Nations, and what do you think there's anything different that we should be doing or can do?
No, I think what we are doing right now is exactly what the two other major powers in this region, Russia and China, are doing, which is to trying to protect their own national interest, at least their security concerns. China has done that with the Taliban. Russia, as Dr. Maxim mentioned, has also done that with the Taliban, and so have we. In our statement also, we said that one of the issues discussed was that the Taliban should not allow Afghan soil to be used for anti-Indian or terrorist activities. So we are all, the big powers of the region are trying to protect their own interests first. What is happening in this process, of course, is that the interests of the poor Afghan people have been completely sacrificed by everybody, and the Security Council and the other big powers of the region. And that is natural because the first concern that everybody has, and everybody knows, that the Taliban, while they may not be in the same category as a terrorist organization as perhaps the Al-Qaeda or the ISIS-K, whatever that means, the fact is that given their track record and given even their present state, they are nothing but an organization that have come to power by force. Now, every country in the world had said that there can be no military solution to the Afghan problem. And yet, what we have seen happen on the 15th of August was a military solution. The Taliban walked in with their guns. They weren't welcomed by the people of Kabul with garlands, as liberators would be welcomed. The people of Kabul were running to the airport to try and catch a flight to get out of the country. That is the solution that the world community has imposed or offered to Afghanistan.
Dr. Suchkov, when you talk about Russia, there is a perception that Russia has been getting closer to Pakistan. In India, there is that perception, whether it's right or wrong, both in terms of military or strategic, talks or dealing with them. Even though they've said, Russia has said that you won't give military equipment of certain sorts. But in that protection of self-interest that all countries are doing, and Russia is also one of them, is that the reason why there is a necessity to get closer to the Pakistan, because the Taliban are seen to be controlled or influenced by them?
Right. Well, obviously, when you have, Russia is dealing with nations, in this case, India and Pakistan, that traditionally don't have good relations. It's the similar criticism when Moscow has heard when Russia is dealing with both Israel and Iran and many other cases. To your question, I think it does make sense given the influence Pakistan has on the Taliban does. And Putin spoke with the Pakistani leadership about those things. But I also think Russia does bear, well, first of all, kind of a bigger stake in its head, meaning the role of India in the making of this polycentric world. So it definitely does not want to antagonize India by its policies with Pakistan. That's point number one. Point number two, I think with Pakistan, Russia traditionally has decent relations, but these relations center around very specific areas, such as, say, the military, right? Whereas there is an understanding here in Moscow that the Pakistan under severe influence economic from the Chinese, so there is nothing really there that Russia can seek and gain in that particular sense. But also there is this initiative by the United States that I think has not been greatly put attention to in Moscow, but it will over time. This quote-unquote Northern Quad, right? The quadrilateral with the United States, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan. Now I see more officials in Moscow talking about the potential role of Uzbekistan in the making of the post-American Afghanistan, and whether it poses some risks for Russia, security risks, but also potential political risks, whether the Uzbek authorities are going to be engaged closely with the United States on this one or not. And we can even further stretch this debate into saying that many people here, I think, read it correctly, that the United States is out of Afghanistan militarily, but is not abandoning the place geopolitically or geostrategically. Still very important in the very paradigm that the Americans are now driving this quote-unquote great power rivalry with China and Russia, where Afghanistan may be key leverage. So they speak about increasing intelligence capabilities around the country, and this Northern Quad thing may be very important part of this presence. So I think Russia here is pretty concerned, including over potential Pakistan role in all of this.
Ambassador, your thoughts on Pakistan? There was a question, I think, that was addressed to you. Why is Pakistan, why is there no action ever taken against Pakistan if it is responsible for terrorism as a state policy?
Well, that is a very difficult question to answer. Perhaps because Pakistan is a very strong and very large country. Afghanistan is a small country. So the Soviet Union thought that they could go in and control Afghanistan. America thought that it could go in and control Afghanistan. But neither the Soviet Union nor America tried to interfere in Pakistan and cross the border. Remember, when the Soviets were occupying Afghanistan for 10 years, the Mujahideen were based in Pakistan. But the Soviet Union did not cross the border into Pakistan for their own reasons. And for, I suppose, similar reasons, America did not cross over into Pakistan. So I suppose one could attribute that as a success of Pakistan's foreign policy, that it managed to avoid incurring the wrath of the two superpowers when they were in Afghanistan, while at the same time supporting terrorist groups that were fighting them in that country. I think you'll have to ask Dr. Maxim and some Americans to find out why they did not take action against Pakistan when they were there in Afghanistan. For us, it just is a policy of deception and deceit.
Dr. Suchkov, if you want to take that, also I wanted, since you were mentioning earlier, like both the Chinese and the Russian justification at the Security Council for an abstention was that, there's this good terrorists and bad terrorists that were being created again. And say the ETIM or the Islamic State in Khorasan province, which Russia is worried about entering through Central Asia, or the soft underbelly, as you put it, it was not addressed specifically in the United Nations Security Council. But if you look at the embassies that are open in Kabul, it's Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey. And Russia and China, Iran, and Turkey have all had dealings with the Taliban pre their taking over of Kabul. How do you see that dynamic, Dr. Suchkov?
Well, I think the British embassy is also open in Kabul, and the Taliban are also guarding it. So when was the only reason I mentioned is that the reports here that the British also are kind of doing some deals with Pakistan separately from Americans, perhaps, and that's why you didn't have the Taliban guarding their embassy before, and now they have been guarding them as of a few days back. Which brings me back to my argument that Russia does not want to end up in a situation where all of the major powers are dealing with the Pakistan, are getting something from it, and Russia is kind of on the antagonizing end of it. Definitely, I wouldn't perhaps think, and my sense is that it's not the reading of the Russian leadership that they're good terrorists or bad terrorists, or rather the bigger evil and the smaller evil. And for now, obviously, the ISIS are kind of seen as the bigger evil because of their kind of expansionist agenda, and the Taliban are seen as the smaller evil and the necessary evil, in the sense that, you know, they are there. The situation on the ground evolved in the sense that it evolved, and it's not Russia's fault that it evolved that way. So Russia is left to dealing what it might. What everyone else is left with dealing. But like I said, it remains to be seen how far it will go, and we're still at the initial stages of kind of this makeup.
Right. Ambassador, you spoke about it twice earlier also, but India, I mean, how do we go forward in our policy in terms of when is it that you actually, or do you actually have to formally recognize the Taliban as a government?
Well, I think the policy that we are pursuing right now, which is to wait and watch, is the correct policy to follow. We have got in touch with the Taliban formally, and the prime concern here has been the safety of our people in Afghanistan, and we have sought their help, which we in any case have to if we want to get our people back. In addition, we have laid out to them our red lines, which is no anti-Indian or terrorist activity. I think that's a bit of a much, because in any case, if any country tries to promote anti-Indian activity, it should face the at least the anger of our country, if not our wrath. So the question whether we recognize it or not would depend upon the behavior and the actions of the Taliban as they go along. The first thing would be for the Taliban to form a government, then to show that they are actually in control of the country, at least of the capital. Flights must start from Kabul airport. And I think in general, we should also look at the Taliban's foreign policy to see whether they are actually abiding by the conditions that we and the rest of the international community are laying down for them, which is not to spread instability in the region. I think we should also mention that they should try and reach out to the various sections of people in Afghanistan. It is important that we also speak up for the people who are in Afghanistan, like the Tajiks in Panjshir Valley, who are today surrounded by the Taliban and possibly face a massacre. These are serious human rights and humanitarian concerns, and I don't see why the world community should suddenly shut its eyes to what's happening over there and pretend that everything is hunky-dory in that country. So all these factors, I think, will come into play, and it is only when we are reasonably satisfied that, yes, the Taliban can actually behave like a responsible international power or an international government, then only should we recognize them and give them the feeling that, yes, now they have got recognition. And we must remember that what India does is looked upon with a certain degree of interest, perhaps even respect, in many parts of the world, even now.
Dr. Suchkov, if you want to take that point that Ambassador raised in Panjshir, now the erstwhile Northern Alliance, India, Russia, Iran, and supported the Northern Alliance. Now, there are lots of conflicting reports of what exactly is happening in Panjshir, but it seems to be ruled out, at least internationally, support of the kind that was there before.
Right. Well, that one thing. Also, there are discussions in Russia whether the claims of the leaders in the Panjshir Valley are for real, or it's just part of their bargaining strategy to get some kind of deal with the Taliban, whether it means their inclusion in the government, or whether negotiating the kind of quote-unquote autonomous status for Panjshir, because it's difficult to capture it, and many Russian military officers who have even from their own experience, perhaps, and from the Afghan involvement, would tell you that it's really impossible to capture it. But to have the Panjshir Valley, offer some meaningful resistance to the Taliban, they obviously need more arms and international support and some international backing. That does not seem to be in place right now. So again, these two factors, the international support, which is not there, and the intention of the Panjshir Valley leaders on what exactly do they want. It is just, a kind of a personal revenge motive from the Ahmad Shah Massoud Jr., or again, like I said, their willingness to negotiate autonomy or better status for themselves in the future makeup of the Taliban. These are things to be seen. Russian approach, however, I think, and it also was mentioned by the special envoy, if I get it correctly, that Russia is not in essence against possible federalization if that is the willingness of the Afghans themselves, and if that is something that may help maintain peace in the country. And some of the Russian experts on the region argue that it was a mistake by the Americans to stake on Pashto only and to kind of exclude Tajiks and Uzbeks and Khazars and other minorities from the political process in Afghanistan and from their participation in the power. But again, these are things of the past, and we'll see how it works out in the future.
Ambassador, just wanted your thoughts on how you read China playing the situation, both bilaterally with the Taliban and in multilateral fora.
China has been concerned about its Xinjiang province, where there is a lot of disaffection among the people, and there is this ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic movement, which has links both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. So China's first and most important concern is and will be to ensure that there is no interference coming from Afghanistan into this region, and it wants the Taliban to ensure that. The second interest would be, I suppose, economic, because Afghanistan is extremely rich in natural resources. It has lithium, it has copper. China is a major manufacturing, it is the largest manufacturing country in the world. It can absorb all the raw materials the world can provide to it. So it will be very keen to move into Afghanistan to try and exploit these resources by investing in them. That, of course, is a long distance. That's further in the distant future, because right now security will be extremely important inside Afghanistan. And China's experience with its personnel in Pakistan has not been very good, because they are constantly under attack from different groups of people in Pakistan. So they will treat very carefully about moving their citizens into Afghanistan. They're culturally very different from each other. But yes, in the long term, once the Taliban are able to provide security, China would certainly be interested in that.
Ambassador Dilip Sinha, I absolutely appreciate your experience and expertise, and thank you for giving us time, Ambassador.
Thank you.
And Dr. Suchkov, again, as always, it's a pleasure having you on and getting a fresh perspective on how Russia is dealing with the world. Thank you for your time as well.
Thank you so much. It was great being with you today.
Pleasure to have both of you again on StratNews Global. Thank you. And thank you to all our viewers who watched and participated through your comments live. And welcome to those viewers who watch this later on when it's streaming on our YouTube channel. Well, just a reminder that you can help support us by subscribing on our YouTube channel, spreading the word as well. You can do that on various social media handles, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as well. This is Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi.